My name is Cora Sterling, and I am a restorer of old maps. I spend my days in a sunlit studio above a quiet, cobblestone street in the city of Havenwood, coaxing life back into brittle paper and faded ink. It's a delicate, patient craft, one that requires a steady hand and a deep respect for the stories hidden in the creases and coastlines of the past. My work is a quiet rebellion against the passage of time, a belief that what is true and beautiful can be preserved, that what is torn can be mended. I have always preferred the quiet company of history to the loud, unpredictable present. But on the evening of our family's annual Christmas Eve dinner, the present arrived at my parents' front door with the force of a tidal wave, and I learned that some tears are not meant to be mended, but to be understood as the place where a new map begins. I knocked on the heavy oak door, the cold of the evening seeping into my coat. In one hand, I held a bottle of aged port, and in the other, a spiced pear and almond tart, still warm from my oven. The air on the porch was thick with the scent of pine needles from the wreath and the sweet, resinous smell of cedar logs burning in the hearth. Through the leaded glass panels, I could hear the familiar music of my family, a cascade of laughter, the clink of glasses, the warm, overlapping currents of conversation. It was a sound that, for my entire life, had been both a siren's call and a warning. The door swung open, and the warmth and light spilled out onto the frosty steps. It was my sister Isabel. Her hair was a perfect cascade of dark curls, her velvet dress the color of mulled wine. Her eyes, however, were as sharp and cold as the winter air. She didn't smile. She conducted a swift, silent appraisal, her gaze traveling from my practical boots to the hopeful offering of my tart. Then, she leaned against the doorframe, a casual, dismissive posture that was itself a kind of weapon. "We don't want you here," she said, her voice a low, perfectly modulated blade. "Go find someone else's holiday to complicate." Behind her, the scene was a perfect portrait of familial bliss. My father, Thomas, was carving the glistening ham at the head of the long dining table. My mother, Marion, was pouring a deep red wine into crystal goblets, a gentle smile on her face. My brother, Leo, was tilted back in his chair, roaring with laughter at something our cousin had said. The candlelight danced on their happy, oblivious faces. Not a single head turned toward the door. Not a single person seemed to notice the empty chair, the missing piece of the portrait. They didn't see me standing on the precipice of their warmth, being turned away into the cold. For a single, suspended moment, I stood there. It was just long enough for the delicate, paper-thin structure of my heart to crack cleanly down the middle, a fissure too deep to be seen but felt with seismic certainty. I didn't shatter. I simply broke. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Understood," I said, my own voice sounding distant, as if it belonged to someone else. I stepped back off the porch, my boots crunching on the icy flagstones. I turned and walked down the path, the cold wrapping around me, a physical embrace that was, in that moment, more honest than any I would have received inside. My name is Cora Sterling, and this is the story of how I learned that family is not always a safe harbor. Sometimes it is the uncharted, treacherous water you must learn to navigate on your own. Have you ever stood on the edge of your own life, watching it go on without you? Have you ever realized that the love you've been striving for your entire life came with conditions you were never meant to meet? I reached my car, parked under the skeletal branches of an old maple tree. My hands, numb with cold and shock, rested on the steering wheel. For a moment, I just sat there, in the quiet, frosted darkness of my parents' driveway, the sound of their laughter a faint, muffled pulse from another world. Then, I put the car in reverse and drove away, the pear tart still sitting on the passenger seat, its warm, sweet scent a cruel mockery of the welcome I had hoped for. 10 minutes later, I was driving aimlessly down Havenwood's main street, the festive lights of the old town blurring into streaks of red and green through my unshed tears. That's when my phone began to buzz against the dashboard, a frantic, insistent vibration. I glanced at the screen. Dad. I ignored it. It buzzed again. And again. It was a summons, an alarm. I finally pulled over to the side of the quiet, snow-dusted road and answered, my voice a bare whisper. Hello. Cora. My God, where are you? His voice was not angry, not disappointed. It was raw, breathless panic. It was the voice of a man who had just looked up from a beautiful, intricate map to find a gaping hole where a continent should be. You have to come back. Now. Please. I rolled down the window, letting the freezing air sting my face, grounding me. Why? I whispered, the word a small, wounded puff of steam. You all seemed perfectly happy. What he said next was the sound of my entire world being redrawn. And by the time I turned the car around, pointing its nose back toward the warm, golden lights of my parents' house, I was no longer the quiet, forgotten daughter, the ghost at the feast. I was the cartographer, returning to correct the map with the undeniable ink of the truth. The panic in my father's voice wasn't just a feeling, it was information. It was the first true thing I had heard all night. Your sister. Isabel told us you weren't coming, he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. She said you had other plans, that you were spending the holiday with friends from the city. She said you told her not to make a fuss. A cold, heavy stillness settled over me. Dad, I said, my voice eerily calm. I sent Mom a text 3 days ago confirming I would be there at 7. I told her I was bringing dessert. We never saw it, Cora. I swear to you. He sounded desperate. We thought you were pulling away again. Being distant. Distant. The word they used when my quietness became inconvenient. The word they used when I chose solitude over their particular brand of chaos. So, let me understand, I said, pulling the car to a halt by the old stone bridge at the edge of town. I stared out at the dark, swirling water of the creek below. Isabel told you I wasn't coming. And then, when I showed up at the door, on time, with dessert in hand, she told me I wasn't welcome and shut the door in my face. She what? The sound on the other end of the line was sharp, incredulous. She did what? And in that moment, the full, intricate, and cruel design of it all unfurled in my mind. This wasn't a spontaneous act of malice. This was a strategy. A preemptive strike. Isabel had constructed the narrative of my absence before I had even failed to appear. She had set the stage, made my family comfortable in my rejection of them, filled their glasses, warmed their hearts, and then waited for me to walk into the trap. Because what was more plausible? That the perfect, radiant daughter would lie, or that the quiet, complicated one would be a no-show? She had banked on my silence. She had counted on my retreat. She had spent a lifetime studying my patterns of quiet endurance and weaponized them against me. Cora, my dad's voice broke through my thoughts, thick with a dawning horror. I am so sorry. I didn't know. If I had known. I took a long, slow breath, the cold air burning my lungs. I know you didn't, Dad. But she did. I turned the car around. The drive back was different. I wasn't returning with a bruised heart and a desire to be let in. I was returning with a lifetime of carefully archived evidence. Because while they had been living in the warmth of Isabel's narrative, I had been living in the cold, hard reality of it. And to keep myself sane, to convince myself I wasn't imagining the subtle cruelties, the gaslighting, the quiet erasures, I had kept a record. A digital journal. Screenshots of conversations where my words were twisted. Voicemails where her tone dripped with condescension. And yes, after years of this, I had learned to be prepared. When I had walked up to that door, I had quietly hit record on my phone, a small act of self-preservation. I had a recording of the entire exchange. I even had the audio of her turning from the door and muttering to herself, a triumphant little whisper I hadn't even registered until now. Well, that's that. She had been playing a long, insidious game. I had just been quietly collecting the moves. When I pushed open the front door, which was now unlocked, my father was waiting in the entryway. His face was flushed, his eyes wide and filled with a terrible, helpless sorrow. He wrapped his arms around me, a fierce, clumsy embrace, as if he was trying to physically piece back together something he had just discovered was broken. "I'm so sorry, Cora," he whispered into my hair. But over his shoulder, my gaze found Isabel. She was standing at the far end of the hall, poised and frozen, her champagne flute still in her hand. The practiced, easy smile was gone, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. The color was draining from her face, leaving her perfect dress looking garish and out of place. Her plan had had one critical flaw: it relied on me disappearing. It never accounted for me coming back. And it certainly never accounted for me coming back with the truth. The warm hum of conversation in the dining room faltered and died as I stepped out from my father's embrace. The silence that fell was absolute. Forks hovered over plates. My mother's hand froze on her wine glass, her eyes darting between me and Isabel, a frantic, confused shuttle. "Cora," my mother said, her voice laced with bewilderment. We thought you weren't coming." "Isabel told you that," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence with the clean, sharp edge of a scalpel. I slowly unbuttoned my coat, my movements deliberate. "I never did." Isabel took a step forward, a flicker of her old confidence returning. I must have misunderstood. I didn't want everyone to be disappointed when you didn't show. You've been so absent lately." "Have I been absent?" I asked, meeting her gaze directly. "Or have my absences been curated by you? Have they been explained away before I even had a chance to be present?" My father turned to her, his new, terrible clarity making his eyes look like chips of flint. "Isabel, did you see Cora's text to your mother, or not?" She blinked, a tiny, almost imperceptible flinch. Perhaps I forgot to mention it." "Forgot?" I repeated the word, letting it hang in the air. "Like you forgot to mention the voicemail I left for Mom on her birthday last month? Like you forgot to open the antique botanical print I had framed for your anniversary, even though you posted a picture of it on your design blog, claiming you'd found it at a flea market." A collective gasp went through the room. My cousin lowered her wine glass with a thud. My mother's face was pale with shock. "I have kept the records," I said, my voice quiet but unshakable. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my fingers steady as I navigated to the audio file. I named the folder Cartographies of Truth. I truly didn't want to do this. I wanted to have Christmas dinner with my family. My gaze swept the room, landing on each stunned face. "But I am done being the ghost in this house. I am done being the villain in a story I never wrote." I pressed play. My own voice, hopeful and clear. "Hi. Merry Christmas." Then Isabel's, cold and dismissive. "We don't want you here. Go find someone else's holiday to complicate." The sound of the heavy door closing. And then, the final, damning whisper, "Well, that's that." The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than before. It was the silence of a truth so undeniable it sucked all the air from the room. My aunt, a woman who had always treated me with a sort of pitying kindness, covered her mouth with her hand. My brother, Leo, pushed his chair back and stood up slowly, as if the ground beneath him had become unstable. Isabel took a shaky step backward, her composure finally shattering. "Okay," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Okay, maybe that was unkind. But you make everything so difficult. You've always been so sensitive, so needy." "I haven't been anything," I cut in, my voice rising for the first time, not with anger, but with the force of a lifetime of suppressed truth. "I have simply been reacting to a reality you refuse to let anyone else see. I am not the storm, Isabel. I am the one who has been navigating it alone my entire life." My father turned to her, his face a mask of stone. "Leave," he said, the single word dropping into the silence like a guillotine. "What?" she whispered, looking at him in disbelief. "You heard me," he said, his voice low and guttural. "Get your coat. And get out." "Dad, it's Christmas Eve." She looked around the room, her eyes pleading for an ally, a defender, for anyone to step in and restore the comfortable, familiar order. But no one moved. No one spoke. For the very first time in her life, the spotlight was on her, and it was not flattering. She was utterly, completely alone in the world she had so carefully constructed. She left without another word. No coat, no purse, just the rustle of her velvet dress as she fled into the cold, dark night. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, my mother looked at me, her eyes filled with a dawning, horrified understanding. "Oh, Cora," she whispered. "Why didn't we see it?" I looked around the table, at the faces of my family, all of them staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. "I think," I said softly, "in your own ways, you all did. You just didn't know what you were looking at." Dinner resumed, but the landscape had irrevocably shifted. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by quiet, hesitant conversation. The clinking of glasses sounded tentative. The warmth in the room felt different, less like a cozy fire and more like the aftermath of a fever that had finally broken. And for the first time, the tension in the room wasn't emanating from me. It was a shared unease, the discomfort of a family waking up from a long, collective dream. After the remnants of the pear tart had been eaten, a small, bittersweet victory, my father asked me to join him in his study. The room was lined with books, smelling of leather and old paper, a place of quiet authority that had always intimidated me. He didn't sit behind his large desk. He sank into one of the worn leather armchairs by the cold fireplace and gestured for me to take the other. He looked diminished. Not a patriarch, not a judge, just a man surveying the wreckage of a house he thought was sound. "I failed you," he said, the words stark in the quiet room. I swallowed against the lump in my throat. "You chose to believe her narrative." "I chose the easier path," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Isabel, she's always been so bright, so loud. She paints the world in such bold, confident strokes. You were always quieter, more subtle." It was easier to believe her version of things than to try and decipher the quiet truth of your silence. "I wasn't quiet, Dad," I corrected him gently. "I was silenced." He nodded slowly, and I saw the glint of tears in his eyes. "I should have learned your language, Cora. I should have looked closer at the map. What do you say to that? What words can possibly bridge a chasm that has been forming for 30 years? There were none. So I let him sit with the weight of his own discovery. I let the truth have its own space in the room. He finally looked at me, and it was a look of pure, unvarnished grief. He stood and hugged me, and this time, it was not a hug of panicked apology, but one of profound, sorrowful recognition. "Stay the night," he said. "Please. Let this be the start of something new." I nodded, though I knew this wasn't about starting. It was about ending a pattern that had nearly eroded my soul. Later, tucked into the faded floral quilt of my childhood bed, my phone lit up. Dad had created a new family group chat. He had named it the Family Charter. One by one, the names appeared. My mother, Leo, my aunt, my cousin. Isabel's name was conspicuously absent. There were no grand apologies, just quiet, tentative messages. Leo wrote, "I'm sorry, Cora. We should have been listening." My cousin added, "She never let your light shine. We won't let that happen again." Reading those words, I felt a slow, warm unfurling in my chest. For the first time, I didn't feel like a foreign territory in my own family. I felt like I was on the map. I heard my father downstairs, the clatter of him clearing the dishes Isabel had left on the table. This wasn't revenge. This was a restoration. The next morning, I found a single, beautifully wrapped gift under the tree that I hadn't seen before. The tag, in Isabel's perfect, looping script, read, "To Mom and Dad, with all my love, Isabel and Cora." Even in her giving, she had co-opted my name, my sentiment. She had tried to absorb my existence into her own. I left the gift untouched on the hall table. By noon, her campaign to reclaim the narrative had begun. Her social media was a wash of artistic, black and white photos of snowy landscapes captioned with vague, wounded phrases. Sometimes the most loving act is to walk away from a space where you are not seen. Protecting my peace this season, even when it's the hardest choice. She was expertly casting herself as the misunderstood martyr. In the past, it would have worked. Whispers would have started. But not this time. The family had seen the raw data. They had heard the recording. They knew the truth of the map. My father spent the day making quiet phone calls to every relative, not to command their loyalty, but to simply, humbly, tell the truth. To admit his own blindness. And from what he told me later, the response was nearly universal. We always felt something was off. We just didn't want to cause trouble. I spent the day with my mother in the kitchen, the sunlight streaming in. We worked in a comfortable silence, washing and drying the Christmas china. She paused, holding a delicate, hand-painted saucer up to the light. Then she went to a drawer and pulled out an old photo album, flipping to a specific page. It was a picture of me, about 10 years old, holding up a clay bird I had made in art class, my face alight with pride. Just behind my shoulder, Isabel was rolling her eyes, a performance of disdain for an audience only she could see. She's always been this way, my mother said, her voice filled with a quiet regret. I looked at the photo, at the small girl so proud of her creation, and the other girl already so skilled at diminishing it. Why didn't you ever stop her? I asked, the question I had held inside for decades. My mother was silent for a long time, her fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. Because, she said finally, her voice fragile, we mistook her noise for passion, and we mistook your resilience for contentment. That sentence. It landed in my soul and cracked open a chamber I hadn't known was sealed. They hadn't just ignored my pain, they had admired my ability to withstand it. They had praised the banks of the river for not breaking, without ever asking about the pressure of the flood. That night, I wrote a letter to the little girl in the photograph. You were never the problem, it began. You were a quiet song in a loud room, and they didn't know how to listen. Their inability to hear you is not a reflection of your worth. I ended it with a promise. From now on, we will only sing in rooms where we are heard. We will only set a table for those who are happy to see us take a seat. In the first quiet, stark weeks of January, Isabel made one last attempt. Not a phone call, not a text, but a formal, typed email sent from her work account. I know you feel you have one, it read. But you will never understand the pressure of being the one everyone relies on to be bright and successful. You had the luxury of being the quiet, artistic one. You were always the favorite in your own way. When they eventually find fault with you, as they always do not come to me for shelter. There was no apology, no flicker of remorse. Just one last, desperate attempt to redraw the map with her at the center, a misunderstood hero. I looked at the words, at the familiar, toxic ink. In the past, it would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt. Now, it just felt thin, like a poorly executed forgery. I typed a reply. It was the shortest, truest thing I had ever written to her. Isabel, I was never competing with you. I was only ever trying to exist alongside you. The space you took up did not leave room for me. I am no longer asking for room. I am building my own house. I wish you peace in yours. I hit send. And then I created a filter to send any future emails from her directly to the trash. It was not an act of anger. It was an act of quiet, final curation. Healing, I learned, is not a grand, cinematic event. It is a series of small, quiet choices. It is choosing not to engage. It is hosting a small spring dinner and writing the invitations by hand and not feeling a pang of guilt at the name you omit. It is the steady, quiet work of restoration. The dinner was on the first warm evening in May. I set a long table in my small garden, the one I had inherited from Iris, stringing lights through the branches of the old apple tree. 12 people came. My parents, Leo, my aunt, my cousin, a few close friends who had been my chosen family for years. People who saw me, who had always seen me. After we ate, my father stood, his glass raised. "I want to make a toast," he said, his voice clear and steady in the twilight. "To my daughter, Cora, who taught me that a family is not a fortress to be defended, but a garden to be tended, and that every plant in it needs its own light to grow." As our glasses clinked, a soft, harmonious sound, I looked around at the faces glowing in the warm light. I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost dizzying. This was home. Not a house, not a name, but this feeling, this acceptance, this light. Before she left, my mother hugged me, a real hug, one that held on for a moment too long. "I'm so proud of the woman you are," she whispered. "I'm just sorry we made you build so much of yourself in the dark." I nodded, the old ache in my chest finally replaced by a quiet strength. "It's okay," I said. "It taught me how to find my own light." I heard, months later, that Isabel had moved across the country. A new city, a new audience for her stories. I felt a brief, distant sadness for the people who would now have to learn her language. But I didn't dwell on it. I was too busy with my own work. Too busy restoring the beautiful, damaged things of the world. Too busy living in the truth. On the first real day of summer, I was in my studio, the morning sun pouring through the large windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I was working on a vast, 18th century celestial chart, its constellations faded, its blues and golds dimmed by time. With a tiny brush and a pot of carefully mixed pigment, I touched the tip to a faded star, restoring its light. And I smiled. I was no longer the villain. I was no longer the ghost. I was not the complicated daughter or the quiet one. I was the restorer. The woman who had been handed a map of her world that was torn and false, and had, with a steady hand and a patient heart, learned to make it whole again. I had learned to draw my own boundaries, to chart my own course, to find my own true north. And it was a beautiful, expansive, and finally peaceful place to be.